Welcome to everyone. Good evening, and welcome to Drinks with the Director. I'm Shihoko Goto with the Wilson Center's Asia program. I'm really glad that you've been able to join us today for what we hope will be the first in a series to talk about films that were made in Asia for a domestic audience, which may or may not have done well in the region, but not necessarily have been shown on the big screen in the United States. I'm hoping that this will be a way for us to talk about issues that bring us together, especially during this time of a global pandemic. Kicking off this inaugural discussion, this week, of course, marks the 75th anniversary since the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th, respectively. Next week marks the end of the Pacific War. The Wilson Center, will be releasing a collection of essays and videos with prominent analysts to analyze the legacy of World War II in the Pacific theater. But we also wanted to take this opportunity to talk about World War II and what it meant for civilians and the emotional aspect of dealing with wartime efforts. Hence, our selection for this evening. Grave of the Fireflies is, of course, an animation film, but the story it tells is about children and their survival of the wartime aggressions. It's a harrowing story, which is really quite difficult to watch at times. Here to discuss the film are two Washington insiders in the cinema world. Mary Ratliff, who is the director of 9 Hour Films. She's also a social media specialist with the Wilson Center's Asia program. Christian Oh is also joining us today. He is the president of the board of the DC Asian Pacific American Film Festival. So I wanted to start off, Mary, by asking you, this is, of course, an animation. How effective is anime in telling the story of war and aggression?
I think that that's one of the things that Grave of the Fireflies actually does best, and why it has become such a classic in America as much as it has in Japan, I think, and likely in Europe and other countries as well, because there's something about it, and this is something that Roger Ebert and other critics have pointed out, that in the way that this film doesn't actually aim for realism, and it sort of exists in a surreal fantasy kind of world, that it makes it easier for you to connect with. And also, one of the things that's beautiful about art and about cinema is the fact that it's not usually just someone telling you a story and then it just sort of sits there. It's not someone handing you a thing and then nothing happens. The audience engages with it emotionally by reading something into it themselves, by finding something of their own life to identify with and to bring into it. And by using animation, it's very much a film that exists in the locations that it exists in. They are very distinct. You can tell what they are through the way that they are animated. I think anyone that grew up in that era or has seen those locations would recognize them immediately. But then at the same time, it's not something where you're going to look at it and say, well, you know, that's Tokyo, that's this place, that's not DC, that's not the hometown that I grew up in. You start to feel it a little bit more. And I do also think that there's something to be said for how it hit American audiences. And I don't know that this, you know, I would be interested to know about people that are from an Eastern audience, from Japan and Korea. But one of the things with Americans is that Americans actually tend to see anime and the anime style as everyone in it looks white, which is a whole issue that we could spend another half hour talking about. But I think that in this film, part of what that does is it makes it to where there's not a situation where you're looking at these actors and they're other just because they're another race, that they're actually sort of almost a little bit more amorphous, again, to a Western audience, that they can look at it and they don't automatically say, well, that happened to those people. And so it's something it could happen to our people. It could happen to our children. You start to feel it a little bit more because of that. And it was something that, again, Roger Ebert pointed out that, you know, if this was a war movie that was done in real life, in a realistic live action way, it would be about special effects and about explosions, and like the grim sort of grotesqueness of some of the injuries would be so much, it would go so far that you would kind of be pulled out of it. But because it's animation, those hit very hard. And I think it's very interesting also that this is something that has not been brought to American audiences in a very traditional way, the way that most of the other, like, you know, it was originally a double bill with Totoro, which is a weird juxtaposition, but that, you know, it's the only film that wasn't in the Disney deal. And so it's something that anime fans have been kind of seeking out in like back corners of video stores for a long time before it hit something like Hulu. And I think that that also adds a little bit to it. But I will let us move on a little bit. So,
can I just add one thing? I think the film, in terms of animation, the author of the short story that this is based off of, I think his name is Akiyuki Nosaka, and he had had a lot of offers about making this into a live action film, and he was very against it. And he realized that there was no way to, number one, have contemporary child actors to convincingly play the characters. Number two, the scorched earth that they were trying to artistically convey could not really be part of a real live action film. And so I think, as Mary has pointed out, there is definitely a, what I would say, a focus of the artistic sort of conveyance of this. There was also the director, I think at the time, wanted to use a different type of animation method, but because of time and budget constraints, they went ahead and decided to use the more anime style. The other thing that you should note is that most of the illustration, if you watch it again, and just take note of this, is everything is very brown. And we always tell you that colors tend to emote some feelings. And the reason whenever black was going to be sort of the thing that they were trying to convey, it was actually more brown that they wanted to convey to give it this sort of earthy, more softer feel. And I remember that I think it was the color coordinator or someone who was working on the film, I read back in an article saying that that was the real reason that they wanted to use brown more than black. So to answer the overall question that you had, I think this anime style really did an incredible job to convey those feelings, that emotion, and what the author was really trying to convey. This is not a war film. This is really about this emotional relationship between brother and sister. And I think that's what it was trying to achieve, so.
Yeah, thank you for that, both of you. Before I ask Christian a little bit more about the emotional connection of the film, I was remiss. I did not tell our audience that we're very glad that you're here, and I do hope that this is an opportunity for you to get involved and ask questions as well. My colleague Leslie has already stated in the chat box that we are accepting questions through the chat box. So if you could write down your questions and submit them, we hope to get through them as quickly as we can. So yeah, so Christian, one of the issues that we have about war and historical memory is that it tends to be very politicized, especially in Asia, especially at this time. Does this film help us empathize, see people for the human that they are? Does it enhance our ability to have empathy?
Right.
Or are there limitations to this?
I think the only limitations would be the audience's cultural sort of perspectives. I remember, I mean, I was very young at the time when this film came out in 1988. But I remember that I was reading somewhere later on in life, maybe it might have been in my college years, that in terms of the acceptance of this film, the Japanese would see it, and even the Koreans, Korean Americans that I know, they were very, what's the word? They were very understanding of Seita's decision not to go back to his aunt. They felt that that was a very understandable decision. And they realized that there's pride, the treatment that he was receiving from that aunt. but American and not more Western audiences, when they saw that film, because of the cultural differences, they're like, oh, that was so unwise. He should have been trying to sort of focus on saving his sister. I don't understand why he didn't go back. So that there's that sort of cultural differentiation. But I also think even amongst East Asians, I mean, obviously, this is the Japanese story. Korean American audience and people that I've talked to and friends who are major anime fans, they said, oh, the relationship between brother and sister is very, very similar to the way that they would perceive that in their own Korean culture, Chinese culture, whatever. It's interesting how they were able to connect to that. Whereas in American audiences, they might not be able to connect to some of those things, the order of respect, the order of, parental units. I mean, there's a different type of understanding that happens from an East Asian sort of orientation versus, Western orientation. Overall, though, I think the film internationally, from what I remember reading, it was well received. And then, of course, they tried to, I think in 2005 or 2008, they tried to make a live action version. I never got to see either of them, and I don't know how well it was received, both in Japan and also, here in the Western audiences. I'm just curious if anybody in our participants have seen it and what their thoughts are. But overall, I think the best answer to your question, I think a lot of times we make films that can be relative. As a director myself, I want to make sure that people can relate to the story. And I think both the author of the original short story, as well as the director, they did a really, really, what I would say, pronounced job of making sure that regardless of the cultural differences, this is about a Japanese, brother and sister having to survive after their first they find out their mom dies very quickly, and then later on to find out that the father, who was in the Imperial Navy, had also succumbed to the loss of that fight. I think we can relate to that. I mean, I hope none of us has ever suffered through war. I know my father has. I know my parents' generations have with the Korean War, and then I have other friends and relatives who have gone through the Vietnamese War. There's been so many conflicts, but I think as long as we understand the emotional, I guess, impact and the emotional strings that are attached with these relationships, I think we can all relate. And I think that's what's really universal about this film.
I mean, Mary, would you agree with that assessment that this really focuses on the universality, that we don't necessarily have to have the background knowledge about World War II and what happened in 1945 in particular, that there is this ability to dig deep into the family dynamics, into the emotional status that has some kind of universality?
Yeah, I think so, because it's one thing that, sort of my background with this film is that when I first got to college, which would have been in 1998, it was kind of, I started getting into more anime and meeting more people who have been into anime for longer. And there was a girl that was the president of the anime club at my school and the founder of it, and who had actually studied abroad in Japan. And so this was one of the movies that she would be like, you need to go find this. And this is back in the day that Christian might remember, where you would actually tape trade subtitle, like fan subs on VHS tapes that you would mail back and forth to each other. It was a very different time. And so it was hard to find, but our local indie video store had it, in a back room. And so I knew a little bit of what it was about. I knew it wasn't a feel-good film. I knew I wasn't going to come out of it like, it wasn't Sailor Moon. It wasn't Dragon Ball. It wasn't one of those. But I didn't really know what it was about. And so this is very much a situation where I'm a product of an American school system. I had no idea about most of these events. I had no idea most of these things had happened. You learn about sort of the major hit points of the timeline of World War II, but you don't learn about the fire bombings in Japan. You don't think about how many people were killed by American forces who were civilians in Japan. We don't talk about it. And so that was my first introduction to that piece of history, was this film. And that was very much, it was one of the very first times that I really sat with the idea that history is written by the winners, and that the experience of war is so different for the different people involved. And that, you know, it's kind of, when you're learning about World War II in high school, in middle school in America, it's very much, you know, these are the Axis powers, they're terrible people, they were all very bad. And this showed you that, you know, there were civilians and there were children and they were harmed by our forces. And there were, you know, it's not white hats and black hats. It's not a simple conflict. And this was a movie that does that very, very well without that being its primary goal. And I think that that's part of what's so impressive about it, because especially, you know, I read some interviews with the director where he said, this is not an anti-war film. This is not an anti-war propaganda film. I was just telling a story of a history. I was just saying what happened. And I think that's why it succeeds, is because he wasn't coming at this like, you know, there wasn't a very distinct at the end of it, kind of a button on it saying, this is why we shouldn't fight each other. It was very much just a, this is the story, this is what happened. And it's interesting. I didn't know until I was doing research for this event that it was based on a short story that was based on the author's life, that his younger sister died after the fire bombings of malnutrition, and that this was a way of him sort of dealing with that grief. But it felt real, it felt true. And it did not surprise me one bit that it turned out to be a partially true story, because it does so well at being so relatable and so realistic.
So we actually have a question from Jeff Owen asking if you can kind of elaborate a little bit about the background of the author and how the story is based on his own personal experience. Would you like to, yeah.
Well, the only other, I mean, I think Mary already sort of said a few background about it, but yes, this was a short story with the same name. I think again, like I said, the author's name is Akiyuki Nosaka, and it was about his own personal experience, you know, with his own sister. I think the one thing that I do want to sort of piggyback off of what Mary was saying is that I do remember, Mary, where we were trading. I wanted the subtitled version versus the dubbed version. Right. I hated the dubbed versions because a lot of times you didn't get the emotion that the Japanese dialogue basically.
That's why I don't watch dubs, actually, is because I want the original performance.
Exactly. Yeah. So I even recall that when they did release it in English, there was some criticism. I don't know if it was Ebert or somebody else that said that the girl who was the English voice actor for Setsuko, that it didn't convince him that she was a 4-year-old, you know, Japanese girl. So there's that. But back to Jeff's question, I think, you know, his personal experiences, I haven't read the short story, so I have to confess I didn't read the short story, but I have a feeling based off of what was portrayed in the film, it became a very personal sort of acknowledgement that it was difficult. And it's not, again, it's not saying that war is bad, but it is saying that what we experienced was bad. It was difficult. And thank you, Leslie, for giving additional background. She just posted it there. So bear that in mind, that it really is the tragedy of him and his sister having to survive after, you know, whether it be during the war, at the tail end of the war, and having to sort of really fend for themselves. And again, I think that what to me is because of that sort of personalization, we could connect to. I mean, we all can connect to relationships that we've had with our brothers, sisters, parents, whatever, but it really came through for me in this film. When I first watched the subtitle version, I was just like, wow. When I watched the English dub version, it felt less connected and less enjoyable in my regards. Again,
especially those 90s dubs.
Yes, especially. So.
I was just going to say, it's also worth noting that the director of the film also experienced the bombings as a child. And I think that comes through as well. You know, he didn't have that specific analog of having his sister pass away, but he lived through it as well, through the eyes of a child. Right. And so I think that goes back to this being animation, that like we're seeing this through the eyes of a child. And so the parts that are heightened are so much more heightened, and that gives it that sort of, there's a bit of a fantasy feel to it, because there's a little bit of an imagination to it, and a little bit of the color of memory, that brown instead of a harsh black, and things like that, and those choices. And I think that those choices largely are made because both the writer and director lived through it.
It really is an autobiography, and he's really not an activist. As Christian said, this isn't necessarily a war movie. It's not an anti-war movie. It doesn't really have a strong political position because that's not really who he is. I don't think he's actually done any further war-related films after this. After that, he really kind of focused on more fantasy and the traditional type of animation approach. So, yeah. I know that one of the reasons why we picked it, we had a lot of debate internally about what film we would want to focus on, and we knew it was going to be something related to the Pacific War, World War II, and the Pacific Theater. But I have to say, Leslie, our summer intern, was very instrumental in having us pick it, and I really do want her to kind of share her perspective on this particular work, not to put you in the spotlight.
Yeah, so thank you, Shihoko, for giving me this opportunity to speak up. Yeah, I actually saw this movie when I was in middle school, and during that time, actually the TV dramas and the movies in China actually have a really bad depiction about Japanese soldiers and even the Japanese normal people. So like, I think normal Chinese people, after watching those kind of dramas and movies, will have a general bad impression on the Japanese normal people, like even though they didn't do anything wrong. But after seeing this movie, I feel like I have a brand new impression on the Japanese normal people and how they also suffered a lot during the World War II from the militarism, from the warfare. And also, I think war is bad, like universally. It's not about who invaded who, it's about both sides. And the only one that succeeded in this process will be the winner and the government and the invader. I don't think like there is anyone who will really get something during this process. So I think this movie actually resonates a lot among the Chinese students as well as the normal Chinese people. And I'm really glad that this movie has brought us a new perspective for the war, for the Japanese invasion to China, and for how normal people struggle to have a living during this kind of bad period of time. And I think it also reminds us like the bad impact, by the bad influence of the war. And yeah, I hope that we shouldn't have this kind of war again in the future. So yeah, it always reminds us of the bad circumstances, bad outcomes of the war. That's my personal takeaway. Yeah.
I was actually particularly struck that it hasn't been censored in China, and the viewing is not limited in any way. It doesn't portray Japan in a particularly, it's Japanese defeat, obviously, but it really doesn't push any political buttons in China either. So it is acceptable to the Chinese authorities as well, which I found very intriguing.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I know that we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to speak up, type up. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Mary. So, what would you have done differently?
Oh, like if I was trying to direct this?
If you were trying to tell a story, their story. I mean, is this how you would have gone about doing it, or?
I mean, probably. This is one of those films that, as hard as it is to watch, and there are certain films in life that you have a very hard time telling people that they need to watch. Particularly, it's sort of like when you recommend to someone visiting DC that they need to go to the Holocaust Museum. It's not something that you do for a fun Saturday out. But at the same time, there are very few films in the world that I would say are nearly perfect. That I can't see wrong steps, that I can't see, oh, well, you know, they could have told that storyline a little bit differently. They could have done this a little bit differently. The only thing with this one, you know, if some crazy American executive decided to make an American version, which, you know, is sort of the thing they're doing now, unfortunately, then the only thing that I could see that they would probably immediately want to change is that anime and Japanese film, and also to an extent Korean and Chinese film, don't necessarily adhere to the same sort of strict three-act structure that Western and American films tend to. But this one is very close, actually, I would say, structurally. Like I haven't tried to map it out on a three-act structure, but it probably hews very closely to that Western ideal of the way that stories are told, which I think is one of the reasons that it goes over so well in Western audiences, is that you're not sitting there struggling with things being told out of order or characters who show up for 2 seconds and then go away. You know, I love Mononoke Hime. It's one of my favorite films, but it is one that's a little harder for an American audience to kind of get into because of that, the structural issues, and also a little bit the folklore. So yeah, I mean, this is one that I can't imagine what I would change if we were going to do it over. And that's also the other thing I would say, is that there's a power in fiction that is not there with documentary. I love documentary. I have made documentaries. I'm a very big fan of them. But there's a power in fiction that this harnesses in a way that I think is very instructive. So honestly, I don't see why film schools aren't universally showing this as part of their curriculum to every single film school student, for a lot of those reasons.
Well, I'm going to chime in there. Number one, I agree with Mary that this film is near perfect. I don't know if I would change anything in the linear action. You know, I've heard critics say, oh, they should have moved Seida's death to the end. Why was it at the beginning where we see him pass? And, you know, you see the candy can. I mean, I actually have fond memories of that. My father, he used to travel a lot, and he would bring that same type of candy can with those fruit drops, and they were Japanese 90% of the time, because he would buy them in Korea and they would be Japanese branded. But my point being is, I feel that the film itself, in terms of the arc, in terms of the linearness of it, it works. And I also agree with Mary. I mean, having been a documentary filmmaker, that's where I got my schooling at George Washington for the Documentary Center, basing things, you know, in documentary, there's always this sort of, do you have the subject? Do you have the right moments that you're capturing? You know, versus when you're writing something fictional, you can set up those moments and you can sort of almost lead the witness, as they say, right? So I just feel that the film itself, I have shown it in film class when I used to teach at University of Maryland. I can't show the whole film, but I would be showing bits and pieces from it. And I think it should be sort of part of the, you know, the idea that maybe sometimes a film shouldn't be live action, that you need to use animation, right? Some of our best animated films are because of that. You know, look at what Pixar does, look what Disney does. And I'm going to plug one other film. You guys should definitely check out, if you haven't, another film that does sort of focus on World War II. Is called In This Corner of the World. I think it was from 2016, and it was an amazing wartime drama that really focused on a young girl and her animation, I mean, her drawing. I really recommend that, because it roughly takes place 10 years before and after the atomic bomb. So if you haven't had a chance, again, figure out for yourself, because I don't want to give you the ending and spoil it for you, what you feel in terms of the emotion that an animated film sort of brings out of you. Because it's a lot different from if you're watching the Avengers, if you're watching Star Wars, if you're watching a comic book movie. I mean, much different sort of highs and lows that you're feeling, whereas you're watching anime that seems to be much more, what's the word, visually artistic, and you're like, wow, I can relate to this character. I can relate to that dialogue or that emotion or that scene. I mean, why do you think I love this backdrop that I have on my Zoom? Because that scene of Setsuko sitting in front of that pool is just amazing to me. So bear that in mind, ladies and gentlemen. I think overall, I wouldn't change a thing on the film, but I think that we can utilize animation for so much more ways of telling that story. So I'll end it with that.
Great, great. Well, we did say drinks with the director, so cheers to that.
Cheers, cheers, cheers.
Thank you all for joining us today. I learned a lot. It was a very emotional film that I really found it very difficult not to cry my eyes out multiple times. But I'm really glad that it got rave reviews from both of you, and I think from our participants as well. Again, I'm hoping that we can continue to have a monthly discussion, certainly as long as we are quarantined here on the East Coast. So we will, we'd love your feedback. Let us know if there are any films that you would very much like to watch, and we would certainly consider it. And we hope that you will be able to join us again, and we'll keep you posted on our next meeting. So cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.